Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the nation that gave the world the ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity is on the verge of a crisis that could unravel the European project? And what if the fate of this cornerstone of the Western world now rests on a knife's edge, caught between economic ruin and political extremism? France, a nation long regarded as a pillar of European stability and a bastion of Western culture, finds itself caught in the throes of a profound and multifaceted crisis. This is not a singular challenge that can be isolated and addressed with targeted policy, but rather a perfect storm where deep seated economic frailties have merged with acute political disintegration, creating a feedback loop of instability that threatens the very foundations of the Fifth Republic. The nation is grappling with a dual emergency: a political system in a state of near paralysis and an economic model teetering on the brink of insolvency. The government, once a symbol of decisive leadership in Europe, appears to be crumbling under the weight of its own internal contradictions and external pressures. President Emmanuel Macron, who swept into power on a wave of reformist zeal, now finds himself weakened, isolated, and forced to suspend his flagship projects in the face of overwhelming opposition. This political decay is not happening in a vacuum. It is the direct consequence of and a contributor to a dire economic reality. The economic turmoil facing France is staggering in its scale. The country is contending with a national debt that has soared past an almost unimaginable $4 trillion, a figure that surpasses the nation's entire annual economic output. This debt, which has now eclipsed 110% of its gross domestic product, GDP, is a testament to decades of fiscal imprudence. Compounding this issue is a ballooning budget deficit, which currently stands at approximately 6% of GDP, a rate double the official limit mandated by the European Union for its member states. This precarious financial situation has fueled mounting social unrest as citizens feel the squeeze of a stagnant economy while witnessing the political class engage in what many perceive as ineffective and out of touch maneuvering. The stakes of this dual crisis extend far beyond France's borders. As the Eurozone's second largest economy, accounting for nearly a fifth of the entire bloc's economic activity, a French collapse would not be a localized event. It would trigger catastrophic shockwaves across Europe, potentially plunging the continent into a financial crisis that would dwarf previous emergencies and call into question the viability of the euro itself. France is, in essence, confronting a moment of truth where the unresolved issues of its past are colliding with the harsh realities of the present, creating a volatile and unpredictable future for itself and for all of Europe. Now, to truly comprehend the depth of France's current predicament, one must look back to the post war era, when the nation laid the groundwork for its celebrated social contract. In the decades following the devastation of World War II, France meticulously constructed one of the most generous and comprehensive welfare states the world has ever known. This system, known as l'État providence, the provider state, was built on a solemn promise to its citizens. The state would serve as the ultimate protector from the cradle to the grave. This promise manifested in a vast social safety net that covered virtually every aspect of life. Healthcare was universal and heavily subsidized. If a citizen lost their job, generous government unemployment checks ensured they could stay afloat. Education, from nursery school all the way through university, was to be free of charge, guaranteeing a pathway to knowledge and opportunity regardless of one's socio-economic background. Upon retirement, a state-funded pension awaited, promising dignity and security in one's later years. This model became more than just a set of government programs. It evolved into a core component of the modern French identity. It represented a societal commitment to solidarity, equality, and the belief that the collective should shield the individual from the harshest vicissitudes of life. For decades, this system appeared to be an unmitigated success. The French economy experienced strong growth, living standards were among the highest in the world, and the nation solidified its position as Europe's second largest economy, trailing only the industrial powerhouse of Germany. The French system was admired abroad as proof that a modern nation could successfully blend the dynamism of capitalism with the compassion of a powerful social safety net. However, beneath this veneer of prosperity lay a fundamental and ultimately unsustainable flaw. The entire edifice was built on a foundation of chronic and ever expanding debt. The hefty price tag of this generous social contract was covered not just by already high taxes, but by a relentless reliance on borrowing. This was not a temporary measure used to navigate occasional recessions. It was a permanent feature of the French economic model. In a stunning display of fiscal imbalance, France has run a budget deficit every single year since 1974. For 51 consecutive years, the French state has spent more than it has earned, with each successive government, regardless of its political persuasion, simply borrowing to cover the shortfall. For a time, the negative consequences of this approach were masked. The economy was strong, the workforce was young and expanding, and millions of people were paying into the system, which made the generous benefits feel sustainable. But this demographic advantage was a fleeting one. The economic model was built for a world that no longer exists, and the demographic time bomb that had been ticking for decades finally began to detonate. The most critical factor has been the nation's aging population. The delicate balance between active workers contributing to the system and retirees drawing from it has been irrevocably broken. In the 1990s, France still had a relatively healthy ratio of 5 workers for every one retiree. By today, that ratio has plummeted to just 3 workers for every retiree. This demographic shift has placed an immense and growing strain on the pension and healthcare systems. The numbers are stark. Today, 22% of the French population is retired, a figure that is projected to surge to nearly 30% by the year 2050. Before the middle of this century, almost 1 in every 3 people in France will be a retiree dependent on a shrinking base of workers for their support. This problem is further exacerbated by a triumph of modern medicine: increased longevity. The average French citizen today lives for almost 11 years longer than they did just 50 years ago. While a cause for celebration on a human level, this adds a full decade of pension checks and healthcare bills for every citizen that the system was never designed to handle. The financial equation has been completely upended. More people are drawing benefits for a much longer period, while fewer people are paying into the pot. This demographic pressure could have potentially been offset by a surge in economic output, but here too, France has faltered. The nation is facing a severe productivity problem. French productivity, once among the strongest in Europe, has dropped sharply in recent years. This decline is partly structural. More young people are staying in school longer, collecting advanced degrees in an effort to stand out in a competitive job market. However, the high skilled jobs to match these qualifications have not materialized at the same pace. The result is a generation of overqualified and underemployed workers. Nearly 1 in every 4 university graduates in France ends up in a job that does not even require their level of education. Years of study and investment yield a disappointing payoff for both the individual and the wider economy. Instead of each worker generating more wealth to help balance the system, the average output per worker is falling. The problem is therefore twofold. There are fewer taxpayers shouldering the immense burden of the welfare state, and each one of them is, on average, contributing less than they did before. The promise of the post war era, once a source of national pride, has become an economic liability funded by an ever growing mountain of debt. For many years, these deep structural flaws in the French economy remained largely hidden from plain sight, masked by a favorable international environment that allowed politicians to postpone difficult decisions. The single most important factor in this era of painless debt was the creation of the euro at the turn of the millennium. By joining the single currency, France gained access to historically low borrowing costs. Lenders, reassured by the implicit backing of the entire Eurozone and its more fiscally disciplined members like Germany, were willing to loan money to France at rates that did not accurately reflect its underlying fiscal fragility. This created a dangerous illusion of stability. To French politicians, this cheap debt felt like free money, an easy way to continue funding the generous welfare state and avoid sparking public protests by implementing unpopular but necessary reforms. Why risk a political firestorm by cutting spending or raising the retirement age when borrowing felt painless and without consequence? And so, instead of using this period of low interest rates to put its fiscal house in order, France leaned even more heavily on debt, making the system even more fragile and more vulnerable to an external shock. The first of these shocks arrived in 2008 with the global financial crisis. The crisis hit the French economy hard, and like governments everywhere, Paris was forced to spend billions to bail out its banks and stimulate a recovery. As people lost their jobs, families who had once been net contributors to the system through their taxes now became dependent on it for their survival, relying on unemployment benefits and other forms of social support. The flow of money reversed dramatically. Less was coming into the state's coffers through taxes, while far more was going out in support payments. In the span of just 2 years, France's national debt jumped from an already high 60% of its GDP to a much more alarming 80%. This was the first real warning sign, a clear proof that France's system was far more brittle than it appeared. It should have been a moment of reckoning, a catalyst for fundamental change. But while other heavily indebted European countries like Greece, Spain, and Portugal were forced into painful, internationally supervised bailouts that required deep austerity measures, France managed to slip under the radar. Its economy was deemed too large and too central to the European project to be subjected to the same harsh medicine. There was no sense of urgency to change course. Instead of tightening its finances, France once again benefited from external intervention. The European Central Bank, ECB, in an effort to save the Eurozone from collapse, slashed interest rates to near zero. Suddenly, borrowing was cheap again. And so, rather than learning the lesson of the 2008 crisis, the country doubled down on its debt fueled model. The pattern continued to repeat itself. Dirt cheap interest rates papered over the deep underlying problems. The population was getting older, the workforce was shrinking, and public spending continued to grow every year. But as long as debt was cheap, the tough decisions could be put off for another day. It was a massive gamble that the era of low interest rates would last forever. Then, one day, the gamble failed. The calm was shattered by the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. When the global pandemic froze the economy, the French state had no choice but to step in with unprecedented levels of support. It poured hundreds of billions of euros into solidarity funds, recovery plans, and state guaranteed loans for businesses. It funded massive furlough schemes to prevent mass unemployment, bailed out critical industries, and ramped up emergency healthcare spending. It was a necessary response to an unprecedented crisis, but it came at a catastrophic fiscal cost. By the time the dust had settled, France's national debt had surged past 110% of its GDP. For the first time since the end of World War II, the country owed more than its entire economy produced in a year. This is the point where the illusion finally broke. The French debt crisis was no longer a theoretical concern for economists. It was a stark and unavoidable reality. The truth is that France's welfare state was already far too expensive to run without constant borrowing, and decades of deficits had been baked into the very structure of the system. The pandemic did not create the problem, but it pushed a fragile system over the edge. The calm was over. What remained was a dangerous downward spiral, and France was now fully caught in it. The era of cheap money had ended, interest rates were beginning to climb, and suddenly the cost of funding healthcare, pensions, and benefits felt infinitely heavier. And while the entire French welfare state is under strain, one expense in particular has become the epicenter of the nation's economic and political crisis, eating the system alive from the inside: pensions. The French pension system, once a cornerstone of the post war social contract, has become an unsustainable burden that threatens to bankrupt the state. France now spends more on pensions as a share of its economy than almost any other country in the world. Last year alone, the price tag for funding public pensions was over 350 billion euros. This colossal sum is equivalent to 14% of the nation's entire GDP, a figure that towers far above the European Union average of 10%. To put this into perspective, the French state now spends more on pension payments than it does on education, national defense, and transportation combined. It is a fiscal black hole that consumes an ever larger share of the national budget. However, the real issue isn't just the staggering cost of the pensions themselves. It's the rapidly deteriorating demographic balance between workers and retirees. As previously noted, the system was built during an era of high birth rates and a rapidly growing workforce. Today, with a shrinking workforce and a growing population of retirees who are living longer than ever before, the system is fundamentally broken. It operates a bit like a Ponzi scheme on a pay as you go basis, where the money paid into the system by current workers is almost immediately drawn out to pay the pensions of current retirees. With fewer workers paying in and more retirees drawing out, the system is in a permanent state of deficit. Everybody in France, from economists and investors to the government itself, knows that the system cannot continue like this. The need for reform is not a matter of ideological debate, it is a matter of simple arithmetic. Yet, every single time a leader has attempted to touch this political third rail, the country has exploded in protest. This political paralysis was perfectly illustrated by President Macron's attempt to pass a pension reform in 2023. By international standards, the proposed reform was remarkably modest. The central plank of the proposal was to gradually raise the official retirement age from 62 to 64. For comparison, the retirement age in neighboring Germany and Italy is already 67, and even in the United States, it is 66. In this context, asking French citizens to work for 2 additional years seemed like a reasonable and necessary adjustment. The reaction in France, however, was anything but reasonable. The proposal was met with an explosive wave of public anger. In a single day, more than 3 million people marched through the streets in protest. The country was paralyzed by nationwide strikes that shut down public transport, schools, and oil refineries. In Paris, garbage piled up in the streets as sanitation workers walked off the job. The protests went on for weeks, often turning violent. Public opinion polls showed that nearly 70% of the French population opposed the reform, even as economists were nearly unanimous in their assessment that it was essential to prevent the system's collapse. Faced with this massive backlash and resistance within his own parliament, Macron made a fateful decision. Instead of backing down or seeking a compromise, he chose to force the bill through using a controversial constitutional loophole known as Article 49.3, which allows the government to pass legislation without a vote. Instead of calming things down, this move was seen as an act of authoritarian arrogance, and it only deepened the public's anger. Macron's approval ratings collapsed, and his government barely survived a subsequent no confidence vote. In the end, the reform technically passed into law, but it came at an enormous political cost. Macron's political party lost its majority in parliament, leaving his government weak, fractured, and unable to push through any other major changes. This episode was not an isolated event. It is part of a repeating cycle of failure that has plagued French politics for decades. Every time a previous president, from the right or the left, has tried to touch the pension system, they have run into the same wall of resistance. Each time, the streets have filled with protesters, strikes have broken out, and the proposed reforms have either been severely watered down or abandoned entirely. This is the central trap of the French system. The reforms are desperately needed to avert a fiscal catastrophe, but any attempt to pass them is met with either insurmountable political opposition or a furious public uproar. The result is a state of perpetual paralysis where the government is too divided to act, and the underlying problem gets worse with each passing year. This chronic economic instability and the government's inability to enact meaningful reforms have now precipitated a profound political collapse. The centrist pro-European movement that carried Emmanuel Macron to a stunning victory has been shattered, leaving a power vacuum that is being eagerly filled by the radical fringes of the political spectrum. At the heart of this collapse is the personal political decline of President Macron himself. Once hailed as a dynamic and visionary leader, he is now seen by a vast majority of the French public as an isolated and out-of-touch figure. A staggering 75% of French voters now want him to resign. The French presidency, as designed by Charles de Gaulle for the Fifth Republic, is an immensely powerful institution, often described as a form of republican monarchy. This structure, which concentrates enormous power in the hands of one individual, can be effective in times of national consensus, but it becomes a major liability when the president loses the public's trust. Macron, with his so-called Jupiterian style of leadership, has often been accused of being aloof and arrogant, a perception that was disastrously reinforced by his decision to force through the pension reform against the will of the people. This sense of isolation was further compounded by his spectacular political miscalculation in calling for snap legislative elections. Unhappy with the results of the European elections, he dissolved the National Assembly, clearly expecting that voters would rally behind him and strengthen his parliamentary allies. The opposite happened. His party suffered further losses, and the parliament became even more fragmented and hostile, leaving him a lame duck president. His original pro-business, pro-reform agenda, the very essence of Macronism, has effectively disappeared, replaced by a desperate struggle for political survival. This hollowing out of the political center has created a fertile ground for the rise of extremist forces, most notably the far-right National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen. For years, the French political establishment was held together by an unwritten rule. All mainstream parties would unite to block the far right from ever gaining power. This Republican front is now dead. The National Rally has successfully capitalized on the widespread public anger and the deep-seated mistrust of what many see as a corrupt and self-serving Parisian elite. Le Pen has undertaken a masterful political strategy of de-demonization, softening her party's image and rhetoric to make it appear more moderate and socially acceptable. While the party's core anti-immigration and nationalist positions remain, she presents herself as the defender of the ordinary French citizen against the forces of globalism and a political class that has left them behind. The National Rally's strategy is clear and effective. They block all attempts at compromise on the budget and other key legislation in Parliament, with the ultimate goal of making the country ungovernable and forcing new elections, which current polls suggest they are in a strong position to win. The old sentiment, seen as recently as 2002, when the entire country rose up in protest to prevent Marine Le Pen's father from reaching the presidency, is gone. Today, a significant portion of the electorate is so fed up with the entire political system that they are willing to take a chance on the far right. The rise of the National Rally is not happening in isolation. The political landscape is also being radicalized from the other side, with the anti-democratic far left also gaining traction. This growing voice, often characterized by anti-Semitic undertones and pro-Russian sympathies, further contributes to the fragmentation and polarization of French politics, making a return to stable, consensus-based governance seem all but impossible. And so this terrifying convergence of France's political paralysis and economic decay has sent shockwaves through international financial markets, placing the entire Eurozone in an extraordinarily precarious position. Investor confidence, once unshakable in a core European economy like France, has collapsed. The major credit rating agencies, which act as the arbiters of a country's financial health, have taken notice, downgrading France's credit rating to historic lows. This is not just an abstract judgment, it has real world consequences. A lower credit rating means that it is now more expensive for France to borrow money. Investors perceiving a higher risk of default are demanding higher interest rates in return for lending to the French government. In a deeply worrying development, the interest rate on French government bonds is now on par with that of Italy, a country long considered one of the Eurozone's most significant financial risks. The current financial indicators are flashing red and drawing unsettling parallels to the last great European debt crisis. The numbers today look eerily familiar. In 2010, just before Greece's debt crisis exploded, its 10-year government bonds were trading at a yield of around 3.3%. Right now, France is sitting at almost the exact same level. Back then, all it took was a small spark, a slip in confidence, a wave of selling by investors for Greece's borrowing costs to spiral out of control, locking the country out of financial markets entirely and forcing a massive international bailout. France is now flirting with the same risk, but the stakes are exponentially higher. This leads to the central dilemma for Europe. France is simply too big to fail. While Greece is a relatively small economy, France's economy is nearly 10 times larger. Its national debt, at a staggering 3.3 trillion euros, is so immense that a traditional bailout would be difficult, if not impossible, to assemble. The sheer scale of the required rescue package would be unprecedented. Furthermore, France's systemic importance as a founding member and the second largest economy in the Eurozone means that its failure would undermine the credibility of the entire European project. By flagrantly breaking the EU's own ground rules, running deficits greater than 3% of GDP, and maintaining debt levels far above the 60% limit, France challenges the very principles of fiscal discipline upon which the single currency was built. If even a core member isn't following the rules, why should investors trust the euro? This reality forces the European Central Bank and the leaders of the Eurozone into an impossible choice. The first option would be for the ECB to step in and rescue France, buying up massive quantities of French bonds to prevent a market panic and keep borrowing costs down. However, such a move would create a massive moral hazard. It would send a clear signal to all other member states that fiscal discipline is ultimately optional because the central bank will always be there to bail them out. The second option would be to refuse a rescue, letting market forces take their course. But this would mean allowing one of the founding pillars of the European Union to collapse, an event that could trigger a financial contagion so severe that it could lead to the disintegration of the euro itself. The geopolitical fallout of this crisis would be equally severe. An internally focused France, consumed by its own political and economic problems, can no longer play its traditional role as a strategic engine for the European Union on the world stage. Even more alarming is the prospect of a far-right government led by the National Rally coming to power in Paris. Such a government would likely be fundamentally opposed to international cooperation and deeper European integration, and it has historically maintained close and sympathetic ties with Putin's Russia. The rise of such a government would not just stall the Franco-German partnership that has long driven the EU forward, it would fundamentally reshape the balance of power in Europe with profound and unpredictable consequences for global stability. The potential ascension of the National Rally is not merely a political shift, it represents a seismic event that would challenge the core tenets of the post-war European order. The Franco-German axis, the twin engine that has propelled European integration for over half a century, would likely seize. The cooperative spirit between Paris and Berlin has always been predicated on a shared commitment to a more unified, liberal, and outward-looking Europe. A government in Paris guided by the French first nationalist ideology of the National Rally would be fundamentally at odds with this vision. Instead of collaboration on key issues like climate change, digital regulation, and collective security, the continent would likely witness a new era of discord. Contentious debates over EU budget contributions, the primacy of national law over EU treaties, and border control policies could paralyze the bloc's decision-making processes, leaving it rudderless in a world increasingly dominated by the strategic competition between the United States and China. The EU's ability to act as a cohesive geopolitical force would be critically undermined, perhaps fatally. Domestically, the consequences could be even more explosive. A government led by the National Rally would almost certainly attempt to implement its signature hardline anti-immigration and assimilationist policies. In a country as diverse and multicultural as modern France, with a long and complex history of post-colonial immigration, such policies would be a recipe for social combustion. They would risk alienating large segments of the population, leading to widespread civil unrest that could dwarf the protests seen during the pension reform debate. This could in turn trigger a constitutional crisis, pitting the executive branch against the judiciary and other institutions designed to protect the rights of all citizens. The social fabric of the nation, already strained by economic inequality and cultural tensions, could be torn apart, transforming France from a symbol of liberal democracy into a cautionary tale of democratic backsliding. Furthermore, the economic platform of the National Rally presents a paradox that financial markets would find deeply unsettling. The party has historically blended nationalist protectionism, which would harm France's export-oriented industries, with populist promises of increased social spending and tax cuts for the working class. This agenda is completely disconnected from the fiscal reality of a nation already drowning in debt. Such policies would almost certainly be rejected by investors, causing French borrowing costs to skyrocket and potentially triggering the very sovereign debt crisis that mainstream politicians have spent years trying to avert. This would create a vicious cycle. A populist government elected on a platform of restoring economic sovereignty would find itself at the mercy of international markets, leading to even greater public anger and political instability. The crisis would no longer be a slow burn, it would be an inferno. France's predicament, therefore, is a stark illustration of a broader challenge facing the Western world. When mainstream politics fails to address the legitimate grievances of its citizens, it opens the door to radical forces that promise simple solutions to complex problems, often with catastrophic results. France is at a crossroads, and the path it chooses in the coming months and years will determine not only its own fate, but the future of the entire European project.